The first thing exobiologist Nora Sylvain noticed about the creature was that it was watching her. She had been studying the varrock for 3 standard years, cataloguing their migratory routes across the frozen methane plains of Thuvan IV below. The varrock were enormous beings, each one the size of a pre-collapse ocean freighter, moving slowly across the pale amber landscape on 6 pillar-like legs. Their bodies were armored in overlapping plates of bioluminescent chitin, and when they breathed, plumes of violet gas rose from membrane-lined vents along their flanks. They were not intelligent. Every scan Nora had run confirmed this. They had no centralized neural cluster, no organized social behavior beyond loose seasonal herding, no communication beyond chemical trace signals marking territory. They were, by every metric the galactic cooperative used, animals. And yet this one, a juvenile varrock she had informally named Crestfall for the distinctive ridge along its northern-facing plates, had stopped migrating. It stood 300 meters below Veyrath 9's observation port and it had been standing there for 6 hours. Looking up. Nora pressed her palm to the cold viewport glass. "What are you doing, little one?" Crestfall was not little. It massed roughly 40,000 metric tons. But she had watched it hatch from a gelatinous nest cluster 18 months ago, had logged its first uncertain steps across the methane ice, had tracked its gradual incorporation into the edge of the adult migration. She felt a proprietary tenderness toward it that she knew was scientifically inadvisable. Her research partner, senior analyst Devrak Osel, floated up beside her with a bulb of hot synth coffee. He was a tall man from the high-gravity world of Karum, built broad and careful, with the patient eyes of someone who had spent decades watching things that did not move quickly. "Still there?" he asked. "Still there." Nora took the coffee without looking away. "Devrak, pull up the historical behavioral archive. I want to know if any pre-cooperative era researcher ever documented a varrock ceasing migration to perform sustained upward observation." He was quiet for a moment. She heard the soft chirp of his wrist interface. "No documented cases," he said. Though the pre-cooperative surveys were incomplete. Thuvan IV was flagged for potential resource extraction before the cooperative's founding charter. Nora felt something cold settle in her chest that had nothing to do with the viewport. Meaning they were going to mine it. Meaning they would have. The chitin plates alone would have been worth significant processing as raw construction polymer. Devrak sipped his coffee. The cooperative's founding generation chose differently. Below them, Crestfall shifted. Slowly, with the unhurried grace of a creature that had never in its evolutionary history needed to be quick, it raised the frontal section of its body. 2 of its upper sensory organs, complex clusters of crystalline tissue that functioned something like eyes, oriented upward. Directly toward the station. Nora's breath fogged the glass. "It sees us," she whispered. "It detects the station's thermal signature," Devrak corrected gently. "And possibly our lighting array. It's drawn to warmth differentials." "Maybe." Nora watched Crestfall hold its pose. "Or maybe it's curious. The neurological surveys suggest it lacks the processing architecture for curiosity as we understand it." "We understand curiosity as we experience it," Nora said. "Which is one data point in a galaxy of possible variations." She pulled up her recording interface and began a new log entry. Behind her, Devrak did not argue further. He had worked with Nora long enough to know when she was in the early stages of a discovery, even when neither of them yet understood what was being discovered. The entry she titled simply, "Crestfall Looks Up." Day 1. It would eventually become the seed of a paper that changed how the Galactic Cooperative classified 1,700 species across 43 systems. But that was later. Right now, Nora Sylvain just watched the creature watch her, and tried to understand what it meant that a being with no mapped capacity for wonder had, against all expectation, looked toward the stars. The next morning, 2 more varrock had stopped. They stood beside Crestfall in a loose semicircle, their sensory clusters oriented skyward. The migration continued around them, a river of armored giants flowing past 3 still stones. Nora did not sleep that night. She spent it compiling every scan, every behavioral notation, every chemical trace the station's probes had collected from Crestfall since hatching. She was looking for something she did not have a name for yet. What she found, buried in the atmospheric chemistry readings from 6 months prior, was a trace compound exuded by Crestfall's breathing vents that did not match any catalogued varrock biological output. It was complex. Lad. It had a recursive structural pattern that reminded her, absurdly, of a mathematical sequence she had studied as a student. She flagged it and sent it to Devrak with a single annotation, "Not in the library." His response came 3 minutes later. "I know. I found it 2 months ago and didn't know what to do with it. Nora stared at that message for a long time. Then she looked out the viewport at the 3 still Varric, dark shapes against the amber ice in the station's floodlights. Something was happening on Thuvan IV. Something the old surveys, the ones written by people planning to strip the planet for polymer, would never have waited long enough to see. She opened a new communication channel. Destination, Cooperative Central Science Authority. Priority, urgent. Subject, anomalous developmental behavior in Varric juveniles, Station Verath 9. Requesting immediate review and protective status elevation for study population. She hit send before she could second-guess herself. Below, Crestfall breathed violet plumes into the frozen sky and did not move. Commissioner Taylor Bryn had been reading the old hunting contracts for 3 days, and she had not slept. She was not supposed to be here. The Archive Vault 7 was restricted, accessible only to Historical Commission researchers with Level 9 clearance, and Taylor held Level 7 in her official capacity as Deputy Director of Cooperative Ecological Policy. But her old Academy friend Investigator Juno Corley had slipped her a temporary access key 2 weeks ago, along with a message that said only, "You need to see what they did before us." All of it. The vault smelled of processed air and old data. Physical record storage was rare in the modern cooperative, but the pre-cooperative expansion-era governments had preferred printed contracts. Something about enforceability. Something about the satisfaction of signatures in ink. The file she was reading now was labeled, Thuvan IV Resource Extraction Preliminary Survey and Biological Clearance Assessment. Dated 142 standard years ago. Biological Clearance Assessment. She had learned what that phrase meant 3 days ago. It meant someone had looked at every living thing on a planet and decided whether it was worth keeping or worth removing to enable profitable extraction. The Varric of Thuvan IV had been assessed as non-sentient megafauna. Recommendation: systematic culling to reduce interference with extraction machinery. Estimated timeline for clearance: 4 standard years. 4 years to remove every Varric from a planet they had inhabited for 11 million years. The contract had been signed by 6 corporate entities and 2 planetary governments. All of them were now defunct, absorbed or dissolved in the chaos and reformation that preceded the cooperative's founding. The people who had signed their names to this document were almost certainly dead. The machinery they had planned to deploy had never been deployed. Because the cooperative had been founded first. Because a generation of people, exhausted by extraction and collapse and the slow death of too many worlds, had decided to do something differently. But the contracts existed. The plans existed. The intent existed in ink, in this vault, witnessed by a timestamp that could not be argued with. Taylor set down the file and pressed her hands flat on the table, steadying herself. She had spent her career fighting for protective status for species that lacked it. She had written policy briefs and sat through interminable committee sessions and lobbied representatives from 40 systems to care about creatures that could not vote, could not speak, could not hold signs outside government buildings demanding their own survival. She had always framed it as forward progress. We are building something better than what came before. She had not, until now, fully understood what came before. A soft chime from her interface. A message from Nora Sylvain at Research Station Verath 9. Taylor had been corresponding with the exobiologist for 2 years, ever since Nora's initial paper on anomalous Varric behavioral development had crossed her desk and set her hands trembling with something that felt like hope. She opened it. The message contained a data packet. Nora's latest findings, flagged urgent. Taylor pulled up the summary, reading quickly. The Varric juvenile designated Crestfall had, over the past 8 months, influenced a behavioral change in approximately 3% of the Thuvan IV population. The behavior was consistent across affected individuals: cessation of migration during certain light cycle periods, sustained upward orientation of sensory clusters, and production of an unclassified chemical compound in breathing emissions. The compound had now been analyzed by 4 independent xenochemistry labs. All 4 had reached the same conclusion. It was a signal. A slow, patient, chemical signal being broadcast into the upper atmosphere by hundreds of creatures that were not, according to all previous assessments, capable of intentional communication. Taylor read the conclusion line twice: recommend immediate reclassification of Varric as Tier 2 potentially sentient species, with full protective moratorium on all extraction activities in Thuvan system. She looked at the old contract on the table in front of her. Then she looked at the message on her screen. 142 years. The Varric had been broadcasting this signal, perhaps, for longer than humans had been visiting their world. Or perhaps Crestfall was something new, an individual who had changed something in the species' ancient and patient way of being. Either way, the signal had only been received because someone had been watching. Because Nora Sylvain had been given a research station and a budget and years to simply look at something the previous generation had scheduled for destruction. Taylor began composing a response. She also began composing a second message, this one addressed to the full Cooperative Ecological Policy Board, requesting an emergency session. She attached the old contract as an exhibit. She titled it, "Why We Cannot Afford to Look Away." Juno Corley appeared in the vault doorway, holding 2 cups of coffee. She looked at Taylor's face and set both cups down without speaking. "The Varric are signaling," Taylor said. "I know. I saw Sylvain's data last week. And the contracts. You knew about all of this." "I suspected. I wanted you to see it yourself." Juno sat down across from her. "The question isn't what happened before us. The question is what we do now." Taylor picked up one of the coffee cups. Her hands had stopped shaking. Something had settled in her, not peace exactly, but purpose. The particular clarity of a person who understands, fully, what they are responsible for. "We reclassify," she said. "We protect. We fund Sylvain's station for another decade at minimum. We seal these contracts and publish them as a permanent record of what the alternative looks like." She paused. "And we look at every other species that was assessed before the cooperative's founding. All of them. Starting immediately." Juno nodded slowly. "That is going to make a lot of people uncomfortable." "Good," Taylor said. "Discomfort is how you know you're actually looking at something real." Dr. Pev Marshall had been on the surface of Thuvan IV for 11 days before he understood why the Varric were not afraid of him. He was the cooperative's lead xenopathologist, a man who had spent 30 years studying the physiological responses of non-sentient species to human presence. Fear responses, avoidance behaviors, stress hormone cascades, the particular quality of stillness in a creature that has decided it is being hunted. He knew these signs the way a musician knows silence. He could read them in the set of a creature's body, in the chemical composition of the air around it, in the microvibrations that translated up through his suit's ground sensors from the earth beneath an animal's feet. The Varric showed none of them. He stood now at the edge of the migration path, 200 meters from a cluster of adult Varric moving steadily past him. Each one was a living mountain. The ground trembled with their passing. The displaced air smelled of ammonia and something sweet that the station's analysts were still cataloging. Their bioluminescent plates pulsed in slow, irregular patterns, blue-white against the amber haze. They knew he was there. He was certain of this. 3 of them had angled slightly as they passed, bringing their sensory clusters to orient in his direction. Then they had continued walking. No alarm signals. No acceleration. No stress chemistry in the atmospheric readings. Nothing but the steady, patient continuation of a journey they had been making, in some form, for millions of years. The young researcher assigned to assist him, a field biologist named Aura Castine, fresh from her first posting, appeared at his shoulder. She was small and intensely focused, with the particular intensity of someone who had spent their graduate years studying creatures through glass and had not yet fully absorbed the reality of being among them in person. "They're ignoring us," she said. "They're including us," Pev said. She looked at him. "That's a significant distinction." "It is." He watched another Varric pass, close enough that the displacement of its footfalls pressed against his boots through the ground. An animal that ignores you has decided you are not a threat and not a resource. An animal that includes you has decided you are part of the landscape. Part of the pattern. "You think they recognize us? As a consistent presence?" "The station has been here for 4 years. The surface probes have been active for 2. The chemical trace of our equipment is embedded in their environmental baseline at this point." He paused, watching one of the Varric near the path's edge slow and stop. It was an adult, ancient by the aging markers in its plate coloration, its bioluminescence a deep and steady gold rather than the erratic blue-white of the younger animals. "That one." Designation. Aura checked her interface. Survey tag Varric adult meridional 7. Station team calls her Goldvein. Goldvein had stopped. She was not looking at them. She was looking at a specific point on the ground 6 meters ahead of her, a patch of the amber ice plain that looked, to Pev, identical to every other patch of amber ice plain. Then Goldvein did something the behavioral archive had no classification for. She lowered the frontal section of her body, slowly and with great deliberate care, until 2 of her lower sensory clusters were almost touching the ice. She held this position for approximately 90 seconds. Then she rose, turned at an angle that brought her path approximately 4 meters further from Pev and Aura than her original trajectory, and resumed walking. What was that? Aura whispered. Pev was already pulling up the ground sensor readings. She detected something in the ice. Below the surface. He scrolled through the data. There's a hibernating nest cluster here. Early stage gestation. At least 40 eggs. Goldvein had stepped around a nest that no surface survey had detected. A nest that was buried under 3 meters of methane ice, invisible to everything except, apparently, whatever sense the Varrock used to perceive their world at frequencies humans had not yet mapped. Aura was very quiet for a moment. She didn't want to step on them. No. Aura stopped. That implies awareness of other individuals. Of their vulnerability. Of their value. Yes. She stopped again. We almost classified them as clearance eligible. 50 years ago, before the cooperative, there was a contract. I know about the contract. Pev watched Goldvein's gold-lit form recede into the amber haze. Commissioner Brin published it 6 months ago. Required reading for all field teams operating in systems with pre-cooperative survey history. Aura was quiet for a long time. The migration continued around them, mountain creatures moving in their ancient and patient river, each one navigating around the buried nest cluster with the same careful, deliberate detour. One by one. Each one slowing, sensing, adjusting, continuing. They all knew. Not just Goldvein. All of them. How do they communicate that? Aura finally said. If they don't have language. We don't know yet. Pev began walking slowly alongside the migration path, at a careful distance, matching his pace to theirs. That's why we're here. Aura fell into step beside him. Sylvain thinks the chemical signal is part of it. The compound crestfall has been emitting. Sylvain thinks many things and has been right about most of them. He glanced at her. What do you think? Aura watched the great bodies move. Watched them navigate, collectively, around a nest that none of them could see except through some shared sense that science had not yet named. I think we spent a long time looking at these creatures and deciding what they couldn't do, she said slowly. And now we're finally asking what they can. Above them, Verath 9 was a bright point of light in Thuvan Ivy's pale sky. Nora Sylvain would be at her viewport, logging, watching, adding to the archive of a species that had been patient enough to wait for someone to pay attention. Below their feet, 40 eggs slept in the amber ice, wrapped in an ancient warmth, protected by a migration route that had quietly, over some unknown span of time, learned to step around them. Pev Marshall recorded everything. He was careful not to step anywhere near the nest. Representative Solon Duvert had been arguing for 6 hours, and he was not finished. The Grand Assembly Hall of the Galactic Cooperative held representatives from 214 member systems. It was a vast circular chamber with acoustics so precisely engineered that a person speaking at normal conversation volume from the central podium could be heard clearly in every seat. The designers had intended this as a statement about equality. What it meant in practice was that every sigh, every whispered aside, every shuffle of impatience was also clearly audible to everyone. There had been quite a few sighs in the past 6 hours. Solon was the representative for the Thuvan System Frontier Collective, a loose confederation of 17 worlds that had been petitioning for full cooperative membership for 11 years. They were resource-rich worlds, and they had come to the cooperative's orbit precisely because the cooperative's protective trade frameworks offered them better long-term stability than open extraction markets. They were, in theory, exactly the kind of member the cooperative most wanted. In theory. The Varrock have not been reclassified as sentient, Solon said, for what felt like the 40th time. They have been reclassified as Tier 2 potentially sentient. There is a meaningful difference. Tier 2 status requires a 10-year observation period before any permanent protective designation can be established. During that 10-year period, the cooperative's own charter permits limited resource surveying of non-inhabited surface regions. The Thuvan methane ice deposits are in regions the Varrock do not migrate through in the survey quadrant designated Sector 12 through Sector 19. From the environmental block seats, Representative Yiva Omond raised her flag. Solon nodded. Representative Duvert, the migration patterns of the Varrock are not fully mapped, Yiva said. Researcher Sylvain's own reports indicate that the mapping is approximately 60% complete. To designate any region as not migration adjacent at this stage is premature. Then complete the mapping, Solon said. We are not asking for immediate extraction operations. We are asking for the right to continue surveying while the mapping is completed. My constituents have been waiting 11 years for full membership. The resource frameworks attached to that membership are not abstract to them. They are schools and hospitals and water reclamation infrastructure. A murmur ran through the hall. Solon had been careful to include that line. It was true, and it was also the kind of truth that was difficult to argue against without appearing callous. From the senior committee section, Cooperative Director Hollis Wren leaned forward. She was ancient, 87 standard years, with the composed authority of someone who had chaired more difficult arguments than this one. Representative Duvert. Let me ask you a direct question. Solon straightened. Of course, Director. If the Varric are, at the end of the observation period, determined to be fully sentient. If the signal researcher Sylvain has documented proves to be deliberate interstellar range communication, rather than atmospheric broadcast. If the behavioral complexity we are currently observing represents an intelligence that simply operates on a timescale different from our own. What is your position then? The hall was very quiet. Solon had prepared for this question. He had rehearsed 3 different answers. He chose none of them. Then we adapt our resource plans, he said. As we should. And the 11-year wait your constituents have already endured would be extended. Yes. He paused. Director, I am not here arguing that the Varric do not matter. I am arguing that my constituents also matter. I am arguing that the cooperative has a responsibility to beings who can speak in this hall as well as to beings who communicate in chemical traces across an alien sky. I am asking for a framework that holds both of those responsibilities simultaneously, rather than resolving the tension by simply privileging one. Another murmur. This one different. Less resistant. Commissioner Taylor Bryn, seated in the Ecological Policy section, spoke for the first time since the session began. Her voice was calm. The framework exists, she said. It requires only the will to apply it. Full cooperative membership for the Thuvan Frontier Collective, with resource rights restricted to systems without Tier 2 or higher designations. Thuvan IV and its moons placed under research moratorium for the duration of the observation period. Frontier Collective representatives given full voting rights on all policy matters, including ecological protection policy. She looked at Solon directly. Your constituents get their schools and hospitals. The Varric get their decade. At the end of it, we decide together what comes next, with better information than we have now. Solon stood very still for a moment. The offer was more than he had expected. Why, he said carefully, would the ecological bloc agree to that? Bryn held up a physical document. Printed pages, ink on material. Old style, archival. Because 142 years ago, someone decided the tension was too complicated and resolved it the easy way. She set it down. We published the result. Everyone in this hall has read it. We are not going to do that again. The vote, when it finally came, was not close. 189 for, 12 abstaining, 13 against. The 13 were loud in their objections. They were also, in the recording of this session that would eventually become required study for cooperative history students across 40 systems, clearly outnumbered. In the hallway afterward, Solon Duvert found himself walking beside Taylor Bryn. He was taller than her by nearly half a meter. She moved quickly for her age. You knew I would take the framework, he said. I hoped you would, she said. There's a difference. What if I hadn't? She glanced at him. Then we would have had a harder conversation. And it would have taken longer. But the outcome would have been the same. She paused at a corridor junction. We protect what we can protect, representative. And we do not pretend the cost is zero. But we also do not pretend the alternative has no cost. She nodded once, precisely, and turned down the left corridor. Solon stood at the junction for a moment, thinking about a creature the size of a freighter that stepped carefully around buried eggs it could not see. Then he went to find his staff and tell them the news. Professor Lyrath Osei was teaching the class she had waited her entire academic career to teach. The lecture hall was full, which was unusual for an elective course in third-year xenobiology. She had 64 students registered. 71 were seated. The 7 who had arrived without enrollment slips were sitting in the aisles, which was not technically permitted, but Lyrath had decided not to notice them. The course was titled, Calculated Kindness, A History of Human Protective Behavior Toward Non-Human Species. She had submitted the proposal 4 times before the curriculum committee approved it. The committee's primary concern had been the title, which they felt implied a cynicism about the cooperative's foundational ethics. Lyrath had argued, politely and at considerable length, that the cynicism was the point. You will notice, she said now, standing at the center of the curved lecture hall with a holographic display filling the space behind her, that I have not called this course a history of human compassion. Or a history of human altruism. I have called it calculated kindness. She paused, looking out at 71 faces. Can anyone tell me why? A student in the third row, a young person from the high mountain world of Verith with the distinctive silver-tinted skin of that biome's population, raised a hand. Lyrath pointed. Because compassion implies an emotional response, the student said. Calculation implies a reasoned one. You're asking which one it actually was. I am asking which one it actually was, Lyrath confirmed. And I am suggesting that the answer matters. Not because compassion is bad, but because calculation is durable. She brought up the first display, a map of the Galactic Cooperative, color-coded by protective ecological designation. Swaths of it glowed green, yellow, and blue. The cooperative protects 11,437 species across its member systems. Of those, 41 have achieved full sentience designation and participate in governance. The remainder cannot vote, cannot petition, cannot argue their own case before this body or any other. She let the number sit in the air for a moment. 11,396 species protected by the decision of beings they cannot communicate with and who, in most cases, they cannot perceive. She advanced the display. The map shifted to a historical timeline. Red zones appeared across it, spreading like heat across certain worlds. Before the cooperative, she said, the number was different. We estimate, based on retrospective surveys and the pre-cooperative extraction records now archived at Merith Station, that approximately 3,400 species were permanently or significantly eliminated from worlds later incorporated into the cooperative. Some during extraction operations. Some as a consequence of habitat destruction. Some through what the old contracts charmingly referred to as biological clearance. She paused. Clearance. As in, clearing the ground of obstacles. The room was quiet in the particular way that rooms become quiet when people are paying real attention. I want to ask you a serious question, Lyrath said. And I want you to think before you answer. She let the silence stretch. Why did it change? She waited. Several hands rose. She called on a student near the back, a tall young woman with the weathered features of someone raised on a frontier world. The cooperative was founded on new ethics, the student said. The generation that built it had seen what extraction did to habitable worlds. They chose differently. That is the official narrative, Lyrath said. And it is true, as far as it goes. But ethics are not self-sustaining. Ethics are maintained by systems. What systems did the cooperative build that made the new ethics durable enough to last 100 years? She advanced the display again. Research station funding records. Survey budgets. Observer deployment schedules. It funded observation. The cooperative's founders built a bureaucracy of watching. Researchers like Nora Sylvain, who has spent 4 years observing Varrock juveniles on Thuvan IV and whose work is the reason we are now considering whether the Varrock deserve full sentience designation. She brought up Sylvain's photograph, a round-faced woman with tired eyes and an expression of permanent mild astonishment. Sylvain did not discover something new about the Varrock. She discovered something that had always been true about them. She discovered it because she was given years and resources to simply look. She walked to the edge of the platform. The old contracts designated the Varrock for clearance. 40,000 metric ton beings that had been navigating around each other's nesting sites for 11 million years, communicating in chemical frequencies that take decades to fully transmit and receive, because their experience of time is not our experience of time. She looked at the student who had raised the question about ethics. The previous generation did not look long enough to see what was there. And so they decided it wasn't. She returned to the display and brought up the title of her course again. Calculated kindness, she said. The cooperative did not protect these species only because its founders felt tenderness toward them. It protected them because its founders were smart enough to understand something important. She paused. What do we lose when we remove something from the world that we don't fully understand yet? Silence. Everything. The silver-skinned student said softly. We lose everything it was. We lose everything it was, Lyrath agreed. And everything it was going to become. And everything we might have learned from it. And everything it might have taught us about ourselves. She advanced the display one final time. An image from Station Verath 9, captured 18 months ago by Nora Sylvain's observation cameras. The Varrock juvenile crestfall, standing still in the amber light, sensory clusters oriented upward toward the station. Looking up. 842 years ago, Lyrath said quietly, this creature was scheduled to be killed before it was born. Today, it is the subject of a cooperative-wide protective review that may result in the reclassification of an entire species and the expansion of cooperative membership criteria to include beings who communicate on timescales we are only beginning to measure. She looked at her students. That change did not happen because of a single moment of human compassion. It happened because of a sustained, funded, institutionalized commitment to paying attention. She closed the display. Your first assignment is to identify one species currently in your home system's survey registry with incomplete behavioral data, and propose an observation framework that accounts for the possibility that the incompleteness reflects a gap in our perception, not a gap in the species. She smiled slightly. Try to think slowly. We are not the only ones with things to say. We are just, historically, the loudest. After class, 7 of the aisle-sitting students stayed behind to ask questions. All 7 enrolled officially the next morning. Geologist Fenra O'Cade found the structure on a Tuesday, which later struck her as an inappropriately mundane day for the kind of discovery that rewrote history. She had been drilling core samples in Sector 9 for 6 weeks, analyzing the lead methane ice for atmospheric data going back approximately 400,000 years. It was painstaking work. The ice preserved chemical records with extraordinary fidelity, and the research team had been building a picture of Thuvan-IV's ancient climate in careful, methodical increments. The drill had stopped at a depth of 60 meters when it encountered something that was not ice. Fenra had pulled the drill head, examined the core sample, and then sat for 20 minutes in her environmental suit on the amber plane just breathing. Then she had called Dr. Pev Marshall, who was the senior researcher on the surface team. Then she had called Nora Sylvain on the station. Then she had sat down again, because her legs had stopped working reliably. What the drill had encountered at 60 meters, sealed within 400,000 years of accumulated methane ice, was a regular geometric structure. Not rock. Not any natural mineral formation she could identify. A structure. With angles. With internal chambers. With walls of a processed material that the initial spectrographic analysis suggested was refined chitin polymer, shaped under pressure into something harder and more permanent than the raw material. Refined chitin. From an organism with chitin plates. Pev arrived 4 hours later. He stood at the edge of the excavation trench Fenra's team had spent the intervening time carefully carving, and he looked down at what they had uncovered, and he did not say anything for a very long time. The structure was not large. Approximately 3 meters across, 2 meters deep, with 6 internal chambers arranged in a pattern that Aura Castine, who had also come from the base camp, said looked like a honeycomb, if honeycombs were made by something with 6 limbs and a radially symmetric body plan. 6 limbs. Like the Varak. How old? Pev said finally. The ice record around the structure dates the deposition consistently, Fenra said. Her voice was very steady. She had worked on it. The structure was sealed in ice approximately 387,000 years ago. Based on the formation patterns, it was functional for at least 40,000 years before that. Pev looked at Aura. Aura looked at the structure. The Varak have no recorded history of construction behavior, she said. No tools. No manipulation appendages capable of refined material work. No recorded history, Fenra said. The surveys were not complete. 60%, Aura said softly. Sylvain's mapping is 60% complete. Pev crouched at the edge of the trench. The structure's walls were smooth and slightly luminescent, catching the floodlights in a way that reminded Fenra of Varak plate glow. 387,000 years ago, he said. Homo sapiens were still in a single continent. We had not yet developed symbolic language. We were still using flint, Fenra said. And something on this planet was building storage structures from processed materials. He paused. Storage structures. That's what these chambers are. Fenra nodded. The biochemical residue in 4 of the 6 chambers is consistent with preserved biological material. Organic compounds. We won't have full analysis for another week, but initial readings suggest plant matter. Preserved food. The 3 of them were quiet for a moment. They stored food, Aura said. Planning for later. Understanding that later would come and would have needs. That is one interpretation, Pev said. Is there another? He was quiet. Below him, the ancient structure sat in its excavated trench, 387,000 years and counting, sealed in amber ice, waiting for someone to look at it. When the Varak were assessed for biological clearance, he said slowly, The survey team spent 16 days on this planet. 16 days, Fenrir confirmed. I pulled the pre-cooperative survey records when we arrived. 16 days. Aerial survey only, no surface teams. 16 days, Pev said again. He stood. We have been here 4 years, and we found this by accident, drilling core samples for a climate study. Nora Sylvain's voice crackled through Fenrir's communication earpiece. She had been patched in from the station since Pev's arrival, listening. Are you sending me the spectrographic data? Transmitting now, Fenrir said. A pause. The chitin composition is 83% analogous to contemporary adult Varrock plate material, Nora said. Accounting for evolutionary drift over 400,000 years, that is consistent with Varrock origin. So they built this, Ora said. Not a question. Something built this, Nora said carefully. Something on this planet, with Varrock analogous biology, with the capacity for material processing and geometric construction, built this. Whether that something is a direct ancestor of the modern Varrock or a related species that no longer exists is a question we cannot yet answer. But if it's a direct ancestor, Pev said, then the Varrock are not just exhibiting emergent behavioral complexity now. They are exhibiting behavioral regression from a prior technological state. The silence on the channel stretched. What could cause that? Ora said. Many things, Nora said. A catastrophic event. A climate shift. A predator pressure that made distributed migration more adaptive than concentrated settlement. Or. She paused. Or it was a choice. Made gradually, over thousands of generations, for reasons we do not yet understand. Fenrir looked at the structure. At its 6 chambers. At the walls that caught the floodlights and glowed, faintly, like bioluminescence. They remember, she said. The others looked at her. The chemical signal, she said. The one Crestfall started broadcasting. The one that's spreading through the population. What if it's not new? What if they already know what they are? What they were? She gestured at the structure. What if the signal is the memory? Above them, at the edge of the excavation site, a Varrock had stopped. An adult, anonymous in the amber light, its sensory clusters oriented downward toward the trench. Toward the structure. It stood there for 2 hours, motionless, while the research team worked below it. When it finally moved on, it did not detour. It walked directly over the site, placing each foot with extraordinary precision, exactly between the excavation markers, disturbing nothing. It knew the shape of what was buried here. It had always known. On the morning of the 5th anniversary of her first log entry titled Crestfall Looks Up, Nora Sylvain stood at the observation viewport and watched the Varrock juvenile, now no longer quite a juvenile, stand on the amber ice below and breathe violet light into the sky. Crestfall had grown. All Varrock grew continuously throughout their lives, and Crestfall was now larger than the adults it had once trailed at the edge of the migration. Its plates had shifted from the erratic blue-white of youth to a deep, layered iridescence that shifted color with the angle of Thuvan's primary. In the 5 years since Nora had first begun tracking the anomalous chemical signal in Crestfall's emissions, that signal had spread to approximately 40% of the planet's Varrock population. The chemical analysis team at Merith Station, working with data Nora had supplied, had published 3 papers arguing that the signal had recursive structural properties consistent with encoded information rather than simple atmospheric broadcast. The 4th paper, currently in review, would argue something more specific. Nora had read the draft 6 times. She still felt her hands shake slightly when she thought about its conclusions. The signal was directional. Not broadly atmospheric, as originally assumed. When the full atmospheric sensor array was modeled against the signal's dispersal pattern, accounting for Thuvan IV's particular atmospheric convection currents, the signal concentrated and intensified along specific vectors. Vectors that, when projected outward, passed through the orbital plane where Veyrath 9 had been positioned for 5 years. The Varrock were not broadcasting into the sky generally. They were broadcasting toward the station specifically. Devrak Osil appeared beside her with coffee. He had developed the habit so thoroughly that Nora was no longer sure whether the coffee arrivals were deliberate or some semi-conscious response to finding her at the viewport with that particular set to her shoulders. Thinking about the paper, he said. Thinking about what it means if the paper is right, she said. If it's right, they know we're here. Have known for some time, at species-wide scale. If it's right, Crestfall began this signal shortly after I started taking close behavioral observations. Nora wrapped both hands around the coffee. 18 months after the station began active surface probe deployment. 6 months after I ran the first close approach drone scan. Devrak was quiet for a moment. You think Crestfall was responding to us? I think Crestfall noticed a new thing in the sky and began a conversation, Nora said. And I think we spent 5 years describing that conversation as anomalous behavior. Below them, Crestfall breathed. The violet plumes rose and thinned and rose again. The decision about Varak's sentience designation was scheduled for the Grand Assembly in 8 days. Nora had submitted her full archive. Commissioner Burin had submitted the policy framework. Director Wren had forwarded the Fenra OK team's excavation findings, now confirmed across 3 additional sites in previously unexamined sectors, suggesting that Varak ancestors had maintained a distributed network of constructed sites across the planet's surface for approximately 400,000 years before a climate event approximately 50,000 years ago had prompted the shift to the current migratory lifestyle. They had not lost their intelligence. They had adapted it. Reorganized it around movement rather than construction, around chemical memory rather than physical archive, around collective signal rather than individual record. Their technology was biochemical, distributed across an entire species' physiology, invisible to any survey conducted in 16 days, or 16 months, or even 4 years without the specific, painstaking attention that Nora Sylvain had brought to a single juvenile animal that had done something unexpected with its breathing. The vote was expected to pass. The Varak would receive full sentience designation and, with it, full protective status. The question of their participation in cooperative governance was more complex, and would require years of work to establish any kind of communicative framework, if it was possible at all. The timescale of their signal made real-time dialogue a difficult proposition. But history was full of correspondences conducted across vast distances and long delays. Letters that took years to arrive. Messages that required generations to compose and generations to receive. The cooperative was patient enough, Nora believed, to learn that kind of correspondence. It had been learning for 100 years. On the surface, something changed. Nora leaned forward. Crestfall had shifted its orientation, turning slowly until its primary sensory clusters were aimed directly at the station. This was not unusual. Crestfall had been doing this intermittently for 2 years, always during the signal broadcasts. What was unusual was what happened next. The bioluminescent plates along Crestfall's dorsal ridge began to pulse. Not in the slow, arrhythmic pattern typical of Varak plate activity. In a pattern. A sequence. 3 long pulses, 2 short, 3 long again. A pause. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. Another pause. The sequence repeated. Nora was recording everything. She was also, without meaning to, pressing her hand flat against the cold viewport glass. The same gesture she had made 5 years ago, when Crestfall first looked up. Devrak, she said. Her voice was very quiet. I see it, he said. He was already at his workstation, pulling up every sensor array the station had. That pattern. It's not random. No. It doesn't match any catalogued Varak bioluminescent sequence. No. They both watched. The sequence continued. Patient, unhurried, precise. 3 long, 2 short, 3 long. 2 short, 1 long, 2 short. Nora thought of Professor Lyrath Osei's lecture, which had been recorded and shared across the cooperative's academic network. We are not the only ones with things to say. We are just, historically, the loudest. She thought of the structure buried in the ice, 400,000 years old, its 6 chambers shaped by limbs not so different from the ones holding Crestfall's 40,000-ton body on the amber plain. She thought of the old contract in the archive vault, the signatures in ink, the scheduled clearance that had not happened because a generation of exhausted and determined people had decided, at significant political cost and with no guarantee of success, to try something different. She opened a new log entry. She thought for a moment about the title. Crestfall Speaks. Day 1. She began writing. Beside her, Devrak was already composing an urgent transmission to the Grand Assembly, requesting that the sentience vote be accompanied by an additional resolution, a research funding package for xenocommunication studies, a new station to be deployed at lower orbital altitude, and a formal invitation, transmitted in bioluminescent pulses if necessary, for Crestfall of Thuvan IV to participate, however slowly, however indirectly, however patiently, in the conversation that its species had been waiting for long enough. 8 days later, the vote passed. 194-4. On the amber plains below a station that had been watching and learning and trying to listen, Crestfall breathed violet light and pulsed its patient signals into the sky, and had been doing so, in one form or another, since long before there was anyone in that sky to receive them. Humanity had been 142 years late to the conversation. But it had, finally, arrived. And it had come not with weapons or extraction equipment or 16-day surveys. It had come with research stations and funded observation and the long, hard-won institutional wisdom that some things take time to understand, and that the cost of patience is almost always less than the cost of its absence. The Varric did not forgive this tardiness. They were not built for grievance any more than they were built for haste. They were built for the long arc, for the patient signal, for the kind of memory that outlasts ice ages and political systems and the short, urgent lives of beings who had once pointed extraction ships at their world. They were built for this moment and the 10,000 moments like it that would follow, slowly, carefully, across the long bridge of learning that two very different kinds of intelligence were, at last, beginning to build. It would take a long time. It would be worth every year of it. In the amber light below, Crestfall pulsed its light into the sky, and waited, with all the patience of 400,000 years, for the answer.